In the silent hours before dawn, when the world surrenders to shadow and the mind confronts its solitude, certain individuals throughout history have glimpsed something extraordinary, a darkness that does not extinguish, but illuminates. This paradox, encoded in alchemical manuscripts as the Sol Niger, the Black Sun, represents one of humanity's most profound psychological discoveries, hidden for centuries beneath layers of metallurgical allegory and mystical symbolism. The Black Sun emerges not from the external cosmos, but from the interior landscape of human consciousness during its most vulnerable passage, the descent into psychological dissolution. Medieval alchemists, working in their laboratories with lead and mercury, stumbled upon a truth far more valuable than transmuted gold. They discovered that the greatest transformation occurs not in the crucible of fire, but in the crucible of despair. That moment when the soul, stripped of its defenses and illusions, encounters the raw material of its own shadow. This is not the comfortable darkness of sleep, nor the temporary melancholy that passes with the morning light. The Black Sun represents a spiritual eclipse, a phase of the inner work, where everything previously held as certain crumbles into ash. The Spanish mystic John of the Cross would later name this experience the dark night of the soul, but the alchemists understood it first, encoding their psychological insights within the seemingly absurd quest to transform base metals into gold. What compels a human being to voluntarily enter this darkness? The answer lies in a fundamental dissatisfaction with superficial existence, a gnawing sense that the persona we present to the world is a carefully constructed mask, and beneath it lies something both terrifying and essential. The journey toward the Black Sun begins when the discomfort of living inauthentically becomes greater than the fear of confronting what we have repressed, denied, and buried in the unconscious. It is the beginning of a confrontation with totality, where nothing can remain hidden and nothing can be avoided. Carl Gustav Jung, the Swiss psychiatrist who would become the great cartographer of the unconscious, recognized in alchemical symbolism something his colleagues dismissed as medieval superstition, a systematic map of psychological transformation. Jung understood that the alchemists were not failed chemists, but successful psychologists who had discovered the stages of individuation, the process by which a human being becomes whole, and recorded them in the only language available to them, the language of matter and transformation. The doctrine of the Black Sun rests on a radical philosophical premise, that consciousness emerges not from light alone, but from the integration of darkness. Western philosophy, from Plato onward, has largely equated truth with illumination, the good with the bright, and wisdom with clarity. But the alchemical tradition, preserved through Hermetic lineages and rediscovered by Jung, proposes something far more unsettling, that genuine wisdom requires a descent into the underworld of the psyche, a willing encounter with everything we have designated as evil, shameful, or unacceptable. This is the stage the alchemists called Nigredo, the blackening, the putrefaction, the mortification of the false self. In practical alchemical operations, Nigredo referred to the first stage where substances were broken down, decomposed, and reduced to their prima materia, their original chaotic state. Jung recognized this as a metaphor for psychological decomposition, where the ego's carefully constructed identity undergoes dissolution. The Black Sun shines during this phase, illuminating not with the light of day, but with the phosphorescence of decay, showing us exactly what we have been avoiding. The philosophical architecture underlying this process draws from several streams of thought. From Heraclitus comes the principle of enantiodromia, the tendency of things to transform into their opposites at their extremity. From Gnostic Christianity comes the concept of the coincidentia oppositorum, the union of opposites that transcends dualistic thinking. From Eastern philosophy comes the recognition that emptiness and fullness are not contradictions, but complementary aspects of reality. Jung synthesized these streams into a coherent psychological framework. He proposed that the psyche operates through a compensatory principle. Whatever consciousness overemphasizes, the unconscious will underemphasize, creating an internal tension that eventually demands resolution. When we identify entirely with the light, with our virtues, our social personas, our acceptable qualities, we create a corresponding darkness in the unconscious, populated by what Jung called the shadow. All the qualities, impulses, and potentials we have rejected as incompatible with our conscious self-image. The black sun, then, is not a symbol of evil or depression in any clinical sense. It represents a necessary phase of transformation, where consciousness must turn its gaze inward and confront the accumulated contents of the shadow. This confrontation cannot occur through intellectual understanding alone. It requires what the alchemists called solvet coagula, dissolve and coagulate, a complete dissolution of the old identity, followed by a reconstruction at a higher level of integration. The Hermetic tradition understood something modern psychology often forgets. Transformation is not a comfortable process of incremental improvement, but a violent death and rebirth. The black sun burns away everything inauthentic, leaving only what is essential. It is the refiner's fire that the mystics spoke of, the purgative stage that precedes illumination. Without this blackening, without this descent into the depths, any spiritual attainment remains superficial, a collection of concepts rather than a lived transformation. This doctrine challenges the therapeutic culture of our age, which often seeks to eliminate suffering rather than transform through it. The Black Sun teaches that certain forms of darkness are not pathologies to be medicated away, but initiatory experiences that, when consciously integrated, lead to a profound expansion of being. The question is not how to avoid the dark night, but how to endure it with awareness, allowing it to perform its necessary work of destruction and renewal. The descent into the Black Sun follows a predictable architecture, stages recognized across mystical traditions and alchemical manuscripts. Understanding these stages does not make the journey easier, but it provides a map for those who find themselves lost in the darkness, a reminder that others have walked this path and emerged transformed. The call to descent. The journey begins with a disturbance, a crack in the carefully constructed edifice of the ego. This may arrive as a life crisis, divorce, death, professional failure, illness, or as a more subtle dissatisfaction, a growing awareness that the life being lived does not align with the life that wants to be lived. Jung called this the confrontation with the unconscious, and it often manifests as dreams that disturb, symptoms that perplex, or synchronicities that seem to mock the rational worldview. The initial response is typically denial or intensified effort. The ego, sensing threat, doubles down on its strategies of control. More work, more distraction, more medication, more entertainment, anything to avoid the growing darkness at the periphery of consciousness. But the unconscious, once activated, does not relent. The symptoms intensify, the dreams become more vivid, the sense of living inauthentically becomes unbearable. This is the moment the alchemists depicted as the appearance of the prima materia, the raw, chaotic material that must be worked. In psychological terms, it is the first emergence of shadow content, the beginning awareness of all we have repressed. The individual stands at a threshold with a choice that is not really a choice: turn back and remain fragmented, or descend into the darkness and risk everything. The dismantling of the persona. Once the descent begins, the first casualty is the persona, the social mask, the carefully cultivated identity presented to the world. This is what the alchemists meant by the death of the king or the killing of the lion, symbols of the ego's authority and power. Everything that defined the self begins to lose its certainty. Professional identity, social roles, cherished beliefs, even the sense of being a good or moral person, all become questionable. This stage is profoundly disorienting. The individual discovers that much of what they believed about themselves was a fiction, a story told to maintain social acceptability and internal coherence. The masks we wear are not merely social conveniences, but psychological necessities, protecting us from unbearable truths. When these masks disintegrate, what remains is often terrifying in its rawness and ambiguity. Jung observed that patients in this stage often reported feeling like they were going crazy. The stable ground of identity had disappeared, replaced by a shifting, chaotic interior landscape. Dreams during this phase frequently involve images of destruction, buildings crumbling, floods overwhelming cities, volcanic eruptions, Dismemberment. The psyche is communicating through symbol what is occurring internally, a fundamental restructuring of consciousness. The encounter with the shadow. As the persona dissolves, the individual comes face to face with the shadow, the repository of all rejected aspects of the self. This is not merely encountering one's dark side in a simplistic sense. The shadow contains not only destructive impulses and shameful desires, but also creative potentials, vital energies, and authentic aspects of personality that were deemed unacceptable by family, culture, or circumstance. The alchemists depicted this phase as the battle with the dragon, the wrestling with the serpent, or the confrontation with the black raven, all symbols of the dangerous but necessary encounter with unconscious content. In practical terms, this manifests as the recognition of qualities in oneself that one has always despised in others. The realization arrives with sickening clarity: I am not the person I thought I was. I contain cruelty, selfishness, envy, lust, rage, all the qualities I have projected onto others and judged harshly. This recognition can induce what the mystics called spiritual despair, a profound disillusionment with oneself that goes far deeper than ordinary guilt or shame. It is the realization that the moral self-image, the sense of being fundamentally good, was itself a defensive construction. The black sun illuminates these hidden aspects with merciless clarity, allowing no escape into rationalization or denial. Yet paradoxically, this confrontation also brings liberation. When the individual stops fleeing from their shadow and turns to face it directly, a strange alchemy occurs. The energy previously spent on repression becomes available for integration. Qualities that seemed monstrous when hidden in darkness lose some of their charge when acknowledged in consciousness. This is what Jung meant by making the darkness conscious. Not eliminating it, but bringing it into relationship with awareness. The dissolution of the false self. Following the shadow encounter, a deeper dissolution occurs, what the alchemists called the solutio, the dissolution or liquefaction of the hardened substance. This stage involves the recognition that even the authentic self being discovered is itself a construct, another layer of identity that must be surrendered. This is perhaps the most dangerous phase of the journey, the point where many who enter the path become lost. The individual has dismantled their social persona and integrated their shadow, but now faces an even more profound question. If all identities are constructs, what remains? Who or what is witnessing this process of dissolution? The mystics of various traditions describe this stage as the dark night of the spirit, a state beyond ordinary suffering where even the sense of spiritual progress is stripped away. The individual may feel utterly abandoned, without guidance, without ground, without hope. The alchemical texts speak of the blackest of blacks, the Nigredo at its deepest point, where the substance has been reduced to complete formlessness. Psychologically, this manifests as a state of profound not-knowing. All previous frameworks for understanding reality, self, and meaning have collapsed. There is no clear path forward, no technique that helps, no teaching that provides solace. The black sun burns at its darkest, and the individual must simply endure, maintaining consciousness in the midst of complete disorientation. The emergence of the authentic will. It is precisely at this point of maximum dissolution that something unexpected occurs. A new center begins to emerge, not through effort but through surrender. The alchemists called this the appearance of the lapis philosophorum, the philosopher's stone, within the blackened matter. Jung identified this as the activation of the self, the transcendent center of the personality that is distinct from the ego. This is not a return to the old self, nor the construction of a new persona. It is the discovery of a deeper organizing principle within the psyche, what some traditions call the true will, the divine spark, or the inner teacher. This emergence cannot be forced or manufactured. It arises spontaneously when the ego's controlling grip has been sufficiently relaxed. In practical experience, this often manifests as a subtle shift in orientation. Where previously there was frantic doing and controlling, there emerges a capacity for allowing and witnessing. Where there was identification with thoughts and emotions, there develops a spaciousness that can hold experience without being consumed by it. The individual begins to operate from a center of gravity that is deeper than personality, more stable than mood, more authentic than social conditioning. The black sun, having revealed everything that was false, now begins to reveal what is true. Not truth in an intellectual sense, but truth as direct experience of one's essential nature. This is the gold the alchemist spoke of, not literal wealth, but the incorruptible essence that remains when everything conditional has been burned away. To speak of the dark night as merely a difficult phase would be to trivialize an experience that brings individuals to the edge of psychological survival. The crisis of the soul, illuminated by the black sun, is not a mood disorder or a temporary depression. It is an ontological emergency, a fundamental questioning of the meaning and value of existence itself. Jung, drawing from his own descent into the unconscious between 1913 and 1917, understood this crisis intimately. He described feeling as though he were constantly walking on the edge of an abyss, uncertain whether he was experiencing a creative breakthrough or a psychotic break. What distinguished his journey from madness was a thin thread of intention, a commitment to remain conscious throughout the process, to observe and record what was emerging from the unconscious depths. The existential despair encountered during the Nigredo is fundamentally different from ordinary suffering. It is not suffering about something, a loss, a failure, a disappointment, but suffering itself as the ground of being. The individual confronts the arbitrary nature of meaning, the inevitability of death, the isolation of consciousness, and the absurdity of existence. All the stories that once provided comfort and orientation, religious narratives, psychological frameworks, philosophical systems, reveal themselves as defensive constructs against the terror of an indifferent universe. Kierkegaard called this state sickness unto death, a despair so profound that even the wish for death provides no relief, for death itself is part of the problem. Nietzsche's proclamation that God is dead captures something of this experience, not merely the loss of religious belief, but the collapse of any transcendent framework that might guarantee meaning or value. The individual stands naked before the void, stripped of illusions, facing the fundamental groundlessness of existence. Yet the Hermetic tradition insists that this despair is not the end of the journey, but its necessary midpoint. The alchemical texts state clearly, "In sterquiliniis invenitur," in filth it will be found. The philosopher's stone, the pearl of great price, emerges not from purity but from putrefaction. What seems like absolute destruction is actually the clearing away of everything false, making space for something authentic to emerge. The question becomes, how does one endure this darkness without succumbing to it? The mystics and alchemists offer a consistent answer, through consciousness itself, not by escaping the despair, but by remaining present to it, witnessing it, allowing it to unfold without identification or resistance. This is the meaning of the alchemical maxim, visitabis interiora terrae, visit the interior of the earth, a call to descend fully into the darkness rather than fleeing from it. Jung observed that patients who successfully navigated this crisis did so by developing what he called religious attitude, not adherence to any particular doctrine, but a stance of openness to the numinous, the transpersonal, the dimension of experience that transcends the ego. This attitude involves a fundamental trust that the psyche itself has an inherent intelligence, that the processes of dissolution and despair are serving a deeper purpose even when no purpose is visible. The crisis of the soul is also a crisis of control. The ego, whose primary function is to maintain coherence and protect against threat, discovers it cannot control the unconscious processes that have been unleashed. This realization can induce profound terror, the fear of being overwhelmed, of losing one's mind, of being annihilated. But it can also induce a different response, surrender. Not surrender as defeat, but surrender as recognition of a deeper intelligence operating within the psyche. This is the paradox at the heart of the black sun. The darkness that seems to threaten destruction is actually the container for transformation. By fully entering the despair, by withdrawing all projection and denial, by facing the void with open eyes, the individual discovers that consciousness itself is the philosopher's stone, indestructible, radiant, capable of transforming everything it touches. The emergence from the Nigredo does not announce itself with fanfare or sudden enlightenment. It arrives quietly, almost imperceptibly, like the first hint of dawn after the longest night. The individual who has traversed the dark night of the soul does not become someone different, but becomes more fully themselves, integrated, authentic, no longer divided against their own nature. Jung called this achievement individuation, the process by which a person becomes a psychological individual, meaning undivided, whole. This wholeness does not mean perfection or the elimination of darkness, but rather the conscious integration of all aspects of the personality, including those previously rejected or denied. The integrated individual contains multitudes, light and shadow, masculine and feminine, rational and irrational, held together not by repression, but by awareness. The most striking characteristic of those who have successfully navigated the Black Sun is a quality of presence that cannot be faked or performed. Having confronted the depths of their own being, they no longer need to maintain elaborate defenses or projections. There is a relaxation into reality as it is, rather than as one wishes it to be. This is not resignation or passivity, but a kind of active acceptance that can engage fully with life because it is no longer at war with existence. The integrated individual also develops what might be called psychological sovereignty, an internal authority that does not depend on external validation or approval. Having descended into their own depths and discovered the self that transcends the ego, they operate from a center of gravity that remains stable even when circumstances change. This is the gold the alchemists promised, not immunity to suffering, but the capacity to transform suffering into wisdom, to extract meaning from meaninglessness, to find light within darkness. Another profound shift occurs in the relationship to others. Having confronted and integrated their own shadow, the integrated individual projects less onto others. They recognize in every human being the same complexity and contradiction they discovered in themselves. This recognition generates genuine compassion, not the sentimental variety that maintains superiority while offering sympathy, but the deeper compassion that recognizes shared vulnerability and common humanity. The alchemists spoke of the final stage as rebirth, the reddening, the emergence of the red stone, symbolizing the union of opposites and the completion of the great work. In psychological terms, this represents the establishment of a new relationship between ego and self, where the ego no longer attempts to be the master, but becomes the servant of a deeper intelligence. Decisions emerge not from the fractured will of a divided psyche, but from a unified center that has access to both conscious and unconscious wisdom. Yet individuation is not a final state, but an ongoing process. The integrated individual does not transcend the human condition, but inhabits it more fully. They continue to experience darkness, doubt, and difficulty, but these are no longer existential threats. Having learned to navigate the interior landscape, they possess tools and awareness that transform obstacles into opportunities for further growth. The Black Sun, once encountered and integrated, becomes a permanent fixture in the inner sky, a source of wisdom that illuminates from within. The practical fruits of this integration manifest in increased creativity, deeper relationships, greater resilience, and a sense of life lived authentically rather than according to scripts written by others. But perhaps most significantly, the integrated individual becomes a kind of bridge, someone who has traveled between the worlds of consciousness and unconsciousness and returned with something valuable. They become, in the Hermetic sense, an adept, one who can guide others not through instruction alone, but through embodied presence and lived example. The Black Sun burns in the interior firmament of every soul that dares to become itself, not a destination to be reached, but a refinery where all that is false turns to ash, and all that is true reveals itself as indestructible light dwelling in the heart of darkness.